War and Revolution, Section, Germany and the Ancien regime. For all these reasons, the unanimous mobilization against the Third Reich ended up involving a legitimation of the revolutionary tradition as a whole. This was a mental climate that temporarily survived the outbreak of the Cold War in some respects. So much is clear from two books which, although deriving from the opposed alliances, nevertheless exhibit significant common ground. Lukács's balance sheet of the catastrophe of Germany stresses the absence of a revolutionary tradition in that country, whose tragic fate, having already begun to be foreshadowed in 1525, year of the defeat of the peasants who had risen up to abolish serfdom, assumed ever clearer contours as Germany evinced its foreignness or active hostility to the revolutions of the modern age. At virtually the same time, Hannah Arendt intervened. A few years had passed since the end of the war, whose revolutionary significance she had underscored, and which had witnessed la levée en masse of Warsaw's Jews against their oppressors and exterminators. On the one hand, Arendt subsumes Stalin's USSR together with Hitler's regime under the category of totalitarianism. On the other, she reconstructs the parabola leading to Auschwitz, starting, like Lukács, with reactionary critics of Enlightenment and the French Revolution, Boulanger, Burke, and Gobineau. Her harsh assessment of the British Whig is especially significant. His view of liberty as a hereditarily transmitted privilege, and his rejection of the rights of man, were imbued with a sentiment of inequality that would later inspire the imperial metropolis in its relationship with the colonies. In this sense, the first great indictment of the French Revolution already contained the, quote, seeds of racist ideology. A direct line runs from Burke to Disraeli, and the most virulent forms of imperialism, inherited by the Third Reich. Like Lukács in the case of social Darwinism, Arendt pointed the finger at, quote, naturalistic conceptions, which, starting with the liquidation of the ideal of equality, were above all diffused in Britain and Germany. The country that experienced the ominous triumph of the Third Reich was one where Burke had enjoyed considerable influence. The, quote, affinities between German and British racist ideologies were apparent. The country at the head of the anti-French coalitions was obsessed, quote, by theories of heredity and their modern equivalent, eugenics. It was no accident if the hopes of the anti-democrat and racist Gobineau were initially focused on Britain and then, after 1871, on Germany. By contrast, the ideas of the theoretician of natural racial inequality met with little response in post-revolutionary France, which was in the vanguard in achieving political equality. It was the, quote, only country not to discriminate against blacks. A positive judgment of the French Revolution also seems to apply to Robespierre, who is approvingly cited several times for standing firm on the unity of the human race, and for his hostility to colonial conquests. This is all the more significant because it was precisely in the colonies that the Univers concentraire made its first appearance. Arendt takes the example of Egypt under British domination, and large-scale massacres and genocides were perpetrated, with the collapse of, quote, the peaceful Congo population from 20 to 40 million in 1890 and 8 million in 1911, anticipating the horrors of the 20th century. As opposed to the Anglo-German conservative and reactionary tradition, the positive term of the antithesis comprises the American and French revolutionary tradition. At this point in time, the two revolutions were not contrasted. The two declarations of rights were equated and analyzed conjointly. Hence, condemnation of the totalitarian USSR did not as yet involve denunciation of 1789 and 1793. In fact, strictly speaking, it did not even involve condemnation of October 1917, given that, at this stage of her development, Arendt was concerned to distinguish between Lenin's revolutionary dictatorship and Stalin's totalitarianism. Immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet Russia presented itself as a society which, albeit within the limits imposed by a dramatic state of emergency, had a richly articulated internal life, whereas Tsarism had harshly oppressed the various nationalities. Lenin, by contrast, strove to accommodate them to the maximum. There was broad support from ethnic groups, which were able to express themselves as autonomous, cultural, and national entities for the first time. They represented an antidote to the totalitarian regime. Between the amorphous mass and the charismatic head stood a whole series of organisms that impeded and frustrated the latter's immediate volition. In addition to various nationalities, this also applied to other forms of expression of social and political reality. For example, trade unions achieved an organizational autonomy unknown in Tsarist Russia. The rich articulation of the society born of the revolution was completely dismantled by Stalin, who, in order to impose the totalitarian regime, had to artificially create an atomized, amorphous mass, which then became the object or base of the charismatic, unchallenged power of the infallible leader. Moreover, according to the Arendt of the early 1950s, the transition from one phase of the Soviet Union's history to the next was punctuated not by the inexorable logic of Bolshevik ideology, but by the, quote, outbreak of the Civil War. End section.